where we're at is I'm trying to make some understanding between the house of Judah and the house of Israel. We're dealing with the supposed lost tribes. And the reason for making sure we understand the difference between the north and the south. And forgive me, because it seems rather redundant to do this, but for the benefit of those people who don't even know what I'm talking about. Most Bibles have a map. And what you have at the bottom here, where you have Judah, would represent the south, obviously, and this purple part would represent the north. Now, the kingdom was one kingdom, especially united with Saul was the first king, but David, and then ultimately Solomon, his son. See, I just jumped over years and years of history. I'm just jumping in right there because it's seems like the good jumping off point. So when I talk about the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and we talk about two distinct people and two different events. See, when the kingdom was one, these people could basically band together and whip any of their enemies. But separated, well, there was a huge problem. Now, the separation occurred not quite at the death. I always say this, at the death of Solomon. That's a very big general statement. Solomon died in 930 BC because of Solomon's ways. No, I'm not going to do the church lady thing. But he was involved with it. The Bible says he loved many strange women. And it doesn't mean they were strange. It just means they were foreign, and they led his heart astray. See, the Bible's so good. I could just preach a message right there on what happens when you begin to love someone who leads you away from the one who loves you the most, the Lord. But we'll leave that alone. So what we have is essentially the prophet gives a word telling Solomon that the kingdom is going to be rent. It's going to be ripped apart. And there is a prophetic happening, if you will, of the ripped and divided garments. But it's very clear for David, his father's sake, because David was a man after God's own heart, that this would not happen until after Solomon died. And indeed, the test of true prophecy and prophet is whether or not it comes to pass. At the death of Solomon, there is a rebellion that occurs because of essentially a greedy king and taxes. Rehoboam is reigning over the southern kingdom, Judah, while Jeroboam was reigning over the 10-tribed northern kingdom, sometimes referred to as Samaria, House of Israel, or Ephraim. And there'll be other terms that we'll use as our understanding of this grows. Now, King Jeroboam dies. Remember, I just said he's reigning over the north. He dies in 909. And you don't have to remember these dates, but why I'm going to give you dates is I'm building a timeline for something. The timeline is really important. For those folks out there, like the one I told you, I watched a program where they homogenized, no big deal, to say the North and the South basically were carried away in one fell swoop, or there were waves, but they made it like one event. There are progressions of things that happen over time, and failure to understand those historically will lead you to some confusion in the Bible, and will also lead you in some crazy assessments of what happened to these people. So the timeline's pretty important. Jeroboam dies in 909. His son Nadab reigns for 2 years. He's assassinated by Baasha of the house of Issachar. Remember, we've dealt with certain of these tribes and people of notoriety from the tribes, and I've not exhausted. There's just no way to exhaust. Sunday morning, you get an hour at best to put the information out there, and there's so much of it. But we're looking at these people from the different tribes. Now, Baasha destroys the house of Jeroboam, and then he moves the capital to Tirzah. When Baasha died, his son Elah reigned 2 years. Elah was murdered by Zimri, such a nice bunch of people. Zimri then rules, and he is, I don't know, under some duress. He ends up burning down the king's house, the palace, and he inside of it essentially committing suicide. It's under this particular time that there's a split in leadership of what we're looking at, which is the northern portion. Some of the people will follow a man named Tibni. Some of the people will follow a man named Omri as king. When Tibni dies, everybody follows Omri. And Omri is a pivotal person in the history of tracing these so-called lost tribes. Not during his lifetime, but shortly after. We'll call it after his household and generation has passed. Assyrian records will be found much later in the 1800s, mid-late 1800s, that will give with great certainty the references made to the house of Omri, Beit Omri, in some of the Assyrian and other records that have been found, calling these people not House of Israel, but House of Omri. And there may be some other names attached, which we'll look at from the biblical standpoint out of Ezekiel and other books, but I'm just now laying the foundation so we can understand Omri is a very important person, not so much about his reign as a name that will occur. And I must be very careful to say this. We're dealing with an English translation. So for those people who are familiar with Hebrew, you've got the name Omri starting with ayin, which we've put it in the Bible as O Omri, but it's why the name will appear morphed in different languages, and some languages will have a harder reference sound depending on the tongue, whether they are from the cuneiform finds or whatever. We'll find different pronunciation of this very difficult, already difficult for Hebrew scholars to deal with, ayin, that will take on some shades, but it will always refer back to the person we're talking about, Omri. Now, when Omri dies, his son Ahab is king. And Ahab is famous, if you remember, for marrying Jezebel, right? Now, this Ahab is chronicled in the Bible for us, mentioned on the famed Kirk Stele, where Shalmaneser III claims a victory over Ahab the Israelite. And it's spelt out just as plainly as that. The only problem is that the northern kingdom was not fully taken. We know that because there is a great span of time before the kingdom is completely taken. Remember, on a timeline, there's another interesting artifact that is called the Black Obelisk, which has a depiction of Jehu, who will be another successor in the line, doing obeisance, paying homage and tribute to Shalmaneser. So we know that we have these reference points. Just after Jehu's time, references in the Assyrian records to the house of Omri, even though it's talking about Jehu, are referring to a people, house of Israel. So it's super important to get that straight. Now, what is going on? The people of the northern portion, as Assyrian kings begin to forge towards the north, begin to, in small, and there are waves of this, it's not just one event. I'll get to these, I'm a little bit out of sequence, but by 745 BC, Tiglath-Pileser will begin to make advances on the territory. And from that point to his son's reign, all the way down to the one who basically does the final deed, with Sargon being the one who basically 721 is about the final deportation of these northern people. I'll give you specifics in a minute, but about 721 is when Sargon will, recorded in the Assyrian records, carry away a little over 27,000 people. And that's nothing, because there have already been waves of people who have been carried away. And you've got to imagine, if we're dealing with this northern area, which is purple on my map, and purple looks good on radio, we're talking about areas, which I'm going to give you the scripture for as well, where it talks about people being deposited to the lands of Hala, Habor, and Gozan, even the city of the Medes. And this becomes extremely important information for those people who would like to homogenize what will happen in the south at a much later time versus what happens in the north. And the people of the south at a much later time will be deported to another region. They will not even go to the regions that are being mentioned of these people who are crossing over. And remember, I used the scripture out of 1 Kings 14 about the prophet who described the people as being scattered on the other side of the Euphrates. You remember that? So for the people who didn't hear that, let me read that quickly so we have some point of, you don't have to turn there, but I'll read it to you. So there's some bullet point. That's 1 Kings 14:15. You don't have to turn there because I'm not staying there very long. But the prophet comes and he says, giving a whole series of things. He says, "For the Lord shall smite Israel as a reed is shaken in the water, and he shall root up Israel out of this good land, which he gave to their forefathers, and shall scatter them beyond the river, because they have made their groves, provoking the Lord to anger." This is the prophet Ahijah. So coupled with the prophecies out of Hosea, where the prophet of God is told to go and marry a wife of whoredoms and have children. And the first one, he says, name your child. You know, it's great. God gives you the names. You don't even have to think about it. Name your child. The first one, Jezreel. That meaning scattered, sown of God or scattered. And these are all typifying God's people. They're not just randomly giving a baby name. These are typifying, just like the prophet, the man of God, going to marry an unfaithful woman, typifying his people. The naming of these children, symbolic. The first one being scattered of God or sown. The second one, these people will be called no mercy and not my people. And then there's this bright spot in that whole chapter which ends with the prophet saying, but eventually these people in that land will be called the sons of the living God. So it's not all doom and despair. God always, by the way, gives these pictures of grace. And we hardheads, at times we read things and we think, well, that's pretty harsh and that's pretty bad and that's pretty terrible. But there's always, if you're looking, you'll always find where God puts in a word concerning his love and his care for even the worst offenders. That's what is so remarkable. Now, let me just kind of, we're going to jog through history real quick, because I was on the timeline and I jumped to 745. But let me just say a little bit before Tiglath-Pileser. We've got Shalmaneser, and that particular area is important because that begins a period of kings that from Shalmaneser, we'll skip over 5 kings to Tiglath-Pileser, but we'll begin to see the building of an incredible kingdom and power that until a certain time in history will be not a force that pretty much no one could defeat. So Shalmaneser, I skipped over 5 kings to Tiglath-Pileser. He is known to us in the Bible as Pul, referenced as Pul, P-U-L. I quoted that scripture last week. And what is noteworthy are the inscriptions that have been found in cities that he built, some of them named Saka, Danium, and Abrania. And why this is noteworthy is because these are names. We'll deal with Saka, hopefully today, but if not, in another message. But that ties you back to the biblical name Isaac, Danium, which ties you back to the tribe of Dan, and Abrania, which sounds very much like Abraham. So interesting that he is founder of these cities. He's the only one to restore all of the old Babylonian empire, subjected the Hittites. And upon his death, his son, I love this, Ula, better known to you, perhaps, if you're a history person, as Shalmaneser, who is mentioned in 2 Kings 17. So if you want to turn there so we can have some bullet points to kind of hang things on. And it's kind of important that I weave in those references periodically, so I'm not just painting pictures here. And if you're really, really interested and you go to look at the history of the Assyrian kings, you're going to be a little bit confused. There are multiple lists. Depending on which list you are looking at, the Arabic language lists tend to be slightly out of order. And there are some other lists that are slightly different, so that could be a little bit confusing. I'm giving you the bullet points. You can go, if you want to do it, knock yourself out and fill in the blanks. 2 Kings 17 mentions Shalmaneser, beginning where it says, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, began Hoshea, the son of Elah, to reign in Samaria over Israel 9 years. Now let me just pause there and say, this is why it's important to know about north and south. If you hadn't studied this and you didn't know this, you wouldn't even, geographically, you wouldn't know where the hell you are, right? So this is why it's important. How can anybody understand what's going on if you don't know where you are, right? It's just like driving in LA. Now, okay, just a little sidebar for a minute. Why can't they make all the on-ramps on the same side? Is there somebody, do you ever notice that? There's no better way to get lost here than you have to get on the freeway and you can't figure out, do I have to go this way or that way? Shouldn't all the on-ramps going west go in one direction? Never mind. So how do you know where you're going if you don't know where you are? That's my point. Now, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of Israel that were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser, there's our man, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his servant and gave him presents or tribute. Nice. If you keep reading, the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and brought no present to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land, went up to Samaria, besieged it 3 years. And here's the important part here. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria. So if you're looking the difference between the north and the south, Assyria versus those that were carried away by the rivers of Babylon, and placed them in Hala, in Habor by the river of Gozan, and in the city of the Medes. I pause there for a second, because in the Septuagint of this, there's just one little thing that's just a little bit different. And that is here in your King James, it says, and in the cities of the Medes, which would be Media, that area Media, around the Caspian Sea. The Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, done, at least we'll call it minimally 200 or 300 years before Christ's time, reads like this. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of the Assyrians took Samaria, carried Israel away to the Assyrians, settled them in Ale and Abor, these are the same names, near the rivers of Gozan. And here's the little addition I want you to note, and in the mountains of the Medes. And that little in becomes very important, because it means they weren't placed all in one place, number one. Number two, when we begin to look at how these people will begin to migrate, we can actually somewhat trace the paths or the pathway of some of the people who left, for example, from Gozan. We can trace a general pathway based on what I'd call archaeological breadcrumbs that turn up just about everywhere you look. But those who dwelt, as the King James says, in the city of the Medes, or as the Septuagint reads, in the mountains of the Medes, that's a whole different ball of wax. So just hold that thought for a second. These people are dumped into this area. Now you might say, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it has much to do. Everything kind of begins to tie together. If you're going to study the Bible, You're going to study some of these other subjects, archaeology and history, and if you're going to study language, you begin to see all of these interesting things begin to come together. In the Apocrypha, you find the book of, which I mentioned last week, the book of Tobit. And what is interesting about Tobit, unless you have an older King James Bible, the Apocrypha is probably not in your Bible, the Bible you're using today, and it would have to be pretty fat to accommodate it. It was originally in the Bible, and then it was removed. We'll talk about that another day, because that's an interesting subject. But what is interesting about Tobit, this is the parallel Apocrypha, which has got just about some of the best and interesting translations. I'm going to read you, and I find this very interesting. Tobit was from the tribe of Naphtali. And if you were to search in the record of the Chronicles, it says, and Reuben and Gad, and so it pretty much tells you who was moved. We're talking about all the north being taken away. And I would put a footnote, by the way. Some have confused this. There were some, all of the southern Judah is carried away much later by a different group of people. But there is a small portion of those people out of Judah from the upper areas when these attacks were coming that did get taken away. And we do have a record of that. And the record is somewhere around perhaps 200,000 people. But that's a little later. So sometimes people say, well, how do you know who went where? Because the people of the south were referring to those as Jews, Judah and Jews, and the people of the north, it's a scattered bunch. And there were a few of Judah taken away. If you read the record in the Bible carefully, it will point that out. Most people just go right over that. But Tobit, and I wish to read this to you, and I hope I don't bore you. And if I do, too bad. While we lived in Nineveh, I'm reading today's English version. While we lived in Nineveh, all of my relatives and the other, it says Jews, used to eat the same kind of food as the other people who lived there. I refused to do so. Since I took seriously the commands of the Most High God, he made Emperor Shalmaneser respect me, and I was placed in charge of purchasing all the emperor's supplies. Before the emperor died, I made regular trips to the land of Media to buy things for him there. Once, when I was in the city of Rages in Media, I left some bags of money there with Gabriel's brother, and asked him to keep them from me. There were more than 600 pounds of silver coins in those bags. Now, reading this, I'm going to ask you the question, does this sound like a man who is bound in captivity? If he's got the ability to buy provisions for the king and transport his own money and leave it. Obviously, he knew that there was some imminent danger of some kind, but this is a free person moving in and out of territories. It says there were more than 600 pounds of silver coins in those bags. When Shalmaneser died, his son Sennacherib succeeded him as emperor or king. It soon became so dangerous to travel on the roads in Media, I could no longer go there. So that tells you he was a free man who came and went. While Shalmaneser was still emperor or king, I took good care of my own people whenever they were in need. If they were hungry, I shared my food with them. If they needed clothes, I gave them some of my own. Whenever I saw that the dead body of one of my people had been thrown outside the city wall, I gave it a decent burial. One day Sennacherib cursed God, the king of heaven. God punished him, and Sennacherib had to retreat. On his way back to Media, he was so furious that he killed many Israelites. But I secretly removed the bodies and buried them. When Sennacherib later searched for the bodies, he could not find them. Then someone from Nineveh told the emperor, the king, that I was the one who had been burying his victims. As soon as I realized that the king knew all about me and that my life was in danger, I became frightened, so I ran away and hid. Everything I owned was seized and put in the royal treasury. My wife Anna and my son Tobias were all I had left. About 6 weeks later, 2 of Sennacherib's sons assassinated him, nice kids, and then escaped to the mountains of Ararat. Another son, Esarhaddon, became king and put Ahikar, my brother Anael's son, in charge of all the financial affairs of the empire. This was actually the second time Ahikar was appointed to this position, for when Sennacherib was emperor of Assyria, Ahikar had been wine steward, treasurer, and accountant, and had been put in charge of the official seal. Since Ahikar was my nephew, he put in a good word for me with the emperor or the king, and I was allowed to return to Nineveh. So it gives you some cohesiveness, if you will, to a timeline, something of a chronology. Now, not over. Don't go anywhere. I've told you I handle all of this material really carefully. But when you start to read, and I could have brought books and volumes of books to read, I chose the ones that are the more known. I've got, obviously, records from the likes of Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, and I've got the records that we can find from Herodotus and, of course, the works of Josephus. And what's interesting with Josephus is in his writings, he is chronicling the antiquity of the Jews. And if you have, as many of you do have this record of Josephus, luckily it doesn't matter how this book was printed, the chapters, books and chapters are the same. Yes. I was talking to somebody and they said, I watch you on TV and you say, turn to page whatever if you have a Bible like mine. Well, I don't have a Bible like yours, so can you say where you are? I said, I always do. Just pay attention. But chapter 14 in Josephus, it's a lot of reading, but I think it paints a little bit of color. It will actually reference some of the biblical passages, so I'm basically just going to read a portion of where this is coming from. So, Antiquity of the Jews, chapter 14, point 1. When Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, had told him, that's Hoshea, the king of Israel, he had sent him privately to So, the king of Egypt, desiring his assistance against him. He was very angry. We just read that passage, and made an expedition against Samaria. And in the 7th year of the reign of Hoshea, but when he was not admitted into the city by the king, he besieged Samaria 3 years. 3 years. So, when we talk about this sometimes, even reading a passage, we don't really get the idea, even though I read in the reign of, giving you the timeline, we don't necessarily connect the dots. So putting it in plain English, 3 years besieging Samaria is quite some time. Took it by force in the 9th year, which we read, by the way, of the reign of Hoshea, and in the 7th year of Hezekiah, king of Jerusalem, and quite demolished the government of the Israelites and transplanted all the people into Media and Persia, among whom he took King Hoshea alive. And when he had removed these people out of their land, he transplanted other nations out of Cutha, a place so called, for there is still a river of that name in Persia, into Samaria and into the country of the Israelites. So the 10 tribes of the Israelites were removed out of Judea. Now this is a little bit out of sequence of what I'm chronicling to you. Remember, I said I handle the material carefully. 947 years after their forefathers were come out of the land of Egypt and possessed themselves in this country, but 800 years after Joshua had been their leader, and giving kind of a framework of time after they revolted against Rehoboam, which I opened with, grandson of David, and had given the kingdom to Jeroboam. And such a conclusion overtook the Israelites when they had transgressed the laws and would not hearken to the prophets who foretold them this calamity would come upon them if they would not leave off their evil doings. That includes from the beginning Solomon, but straight through the prophets coming and warning the people, turn back to God, turn back to God. And if you've been listening to me over all these years, I've always kept coming back to that. How interesting that the people were getting messengers from God telling them what doom was going to happen if they did not turn back. And God sure didn't say, well, I can't carry it out. He did. He did exactly what he said he was going to do. What gave birth to these evil doings was that sedition which they raised against Rehoboam, the grandson of David. When they set up Jeroboam, his servant to be their king, who by sinning against God and bringing them to imitate his bad example, made God to be their enemy, while Jeroboam underwent that punishment which he justly deserved. And now the king of Assyria invaded all Syria and Phoenicia in a hostile manner. This is giving you a broader picture now. The name of this king is also set down in the archives of Tyre, for he made an expedition against Tyre in the reign of Elulus, and Menander attests to it, another writing history or chronicling, when he wrote his chronology and translated the archives of Tyre into the Greek language, gives us the following history. And there is a whole history here. One whose name was Elulus reigned 36 years. This king, upon the revolt of the Citians, sailed to them, reduced them again to a submission. Against these did the king of Assyria send an army, in a hostile manner overrun all Phoenicia, but soon made peace with all and returned back. But Sidon, Ace, Paletirius revolted, and many other cities that were delivered themselves up to the king of Assyria. Accordingly, these are all important places that we'll deal with perhaps in the future. When the Tyrians would not submit to him, the king returned, fell upon them again, while the Phoenicians had furnished him with 80 ships, 800 men to row them. And when the tyrants had come upon them in 12 ships, and the enemy's ships were dispersed, they took 500 men, prisoners, and the reputation of all the citizens of Tyre was thereby increased. There's a whole chronicle here that keeps going. What is interesting is that Josephus refers to these people, the Kuthians, who will be removed into Samaria. He's also going to refer to some other people who, if we were looking, we begin to find slight traces of information that you can pretty much pick up and start to put together. Why I'm giving you this, and I hope that if you have a copy of this, you'll go back and read out of this 14th chapter, 1, 2, and 3. But what is important is Josephus also chronicles all the way from this time to the time of Cyrus. Now, I'm going to jump ahead again, and then I'll go back and I'll fill in the blanks. But what is so important about Cyrus, we know that Cyrus is the one who will, for the southern portion of people carried away, he is the one who will issue the decree for the people to be able to come back and return to rebuild Jerusalem. It's also this same Cyrus who meets his fate at the hand of a woman, Queen Tamiris, of a group of people called the Massagetae. And what's so fascinating about that is when you understand where the Massagetae come from, these are actually the people of Sak, which belong to a group calling themselves Sakai, which come from what the prophet Amos refers to as the house of Isaac. So we begin to start seeing the breadcrumbs, and you begin to follow the trail. Even Josephus chronicles some of these, and he's not chronicling for the sake of telling you about the lost tribes. He's reporting the antiquity of the Jews. He's giving the history. So it's quite fascinating. But that's, if you want to read that, have fun, knock yourself out. All right. So I'm going to jump back to where we are. If you are interested in further information regarding the archaeological aspect, it would be noteworthy. Here's a guy who never gets any credit. The man who's always credited is Layers, always, the finds at Nineveh. But Paul-Émile Botta was doing very similar work at a very close time period that Layard was doing his work. They both made incredible discoveries. And so if you're interested, it's Botta who uncovers the palace of Sargon II at Khorsabad. And of course, if you're following and looking for things to kind of corroborate what I'm saying here, there could be nothing better than reading about Layard, who set out originally to unearth biblical cities. That was his goal. He set out an incredible mind this man had. If you read all the things that he was capable of doing, that he was schooled in, and ends up unearthing some incredible finds. He first comes across a site, mistaking Nimrud as the site of the capital of Kala, but later he excavates the palace of Sennacherib. And there's some fascinating stories attached to that. But when you start to dig into this, you realize that there's a cache of information even within these archaeological finds, such as, and I've already referenced them, the cuneiform finds by Layard. There were some reports say 20 and some say 23, and I've read as high as 24,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments that were found. And one of them, in fact, there are at least a dozen, but one of them gives such clear information about people who were sent out as spies as the king Urartu was about to attack the people of the land of Gamir. And this is, we're talking about historical finds that are essentially corroborating the information when I talk about the house of Omri, which is being referred to in these finds as Gamir, because I said to you the Assyrians and other languages very similar had the tendency to flip the last two letters. So instead of it being Ri, it became Ir. So the land of Gamir, kind of pretty fascinating. This area that they traversed around Lake Van and the area of Media. So, okay, I've given you the background here. Let me get back to my timeline. By 700 BC, those that had been settled in the place we looked at, Gozan, that is the reference that I looked at in 2 Kings 17:6, Gozan, these people began to move. And if you remember last week, I read to you what 2 Esdras reads regarding these people moving. I'll read it again to refresh your mind. 2 Esdras 13 from the Apocrypha, beginning at verse 40. Those are the 10 tribes which were carried away out of their own land in the time of Hosea the king, or Hoshea the king, who Salmanassar, king of Assyria, led away captive. He carried them over the waters, and they came into another land. And then, of course, he says how that they would go to a country, for through that country there was a great way to go, namely for a year and a half. The same region is called Asareth. They dwelt there until a later time. And we begin to see these people. The journey took that long, wherever they were going. It took that long to get there. So when you start to piece this information together, you realize that these people migrating out of Gozan, that does not represent all the people who were moved around the areas that I've described. Why? Remember, I made reference to those people who perhaps in the mountains, in the city of the Medes, that reference out of the Septuagint and out of the King James. It means by the time that this is happening, about 700 BC, there are people moving and there are people who are not moving just yet. And we begin to start tracing those who move from Gozan, and people begin to appear in the timeline now of history, which is kind of has perplexed many people. I brought with two great sources, which I'm not sure that I want to bore you with, but I may read them this afternoon or tomorrow, from Brill's New Poly, Antiquity, giving us an idea how some of these people who moved around the southern area of the Black Sea are remarkably, for some of these people, some of these historians say the tracing of these people, some tribe is unknown or uncertain, or their origins are uncertain. But about the time that these people start moving, there is an invasion of Phrygia by the people who would be known to the Greeks as the Kimmeroi, or the Kimmerioi, or the English Cimmerian, not Sumerian, Cimmerian with a C, I-M-M. And these people come through, they wipe out, invade an area, and it's a massive group of people. So these people who disappear, and you'll have to get a map. There are plenty of maps online. I was going to do that, and I thought, no, you guys can do your own work. If you're interested, you can look it up yourself. But you begin to see these people moving. So this group of people from the Gozan essentially disappear, and suddenly a mass group of people invades that area of Phrygia. And when you read the secular historians' report, they say it's unknown, we can't be certain about the origins of these people. But when you consider what is later found, it becomes very clear who these people are. And is there a coincidence, perhaps, that the very people who leave one area reappear in another, and they're going in a certain direction? We can follow them. We can, through each of these elements, we can follow the people who were in Gozan versus the people who remained in the city of the Medes and in the mountains of the Medes, because that's even more important. You've got people who are traveling over certain areas that are not remaining around the waters. And that changes the dynamics of where these people might have actually ended up. So if you're looking at a map, it'll make more sense. But back to my storytelling here for a minute. So if you think about it, from the area that they were moved beyond the river, scattered by the Black Sea, and all the way to Cilicia. Now, I'm still on a timeline, so don't think that I've jumped off the cliff here. But the period that we're referring to now, that I've just described, really begins the period that people label the timeline where people begin to reference the lost tribes. Not before, but about this time. And that's important. Of course, with the discoveries at Hallstatt and Laten, we know we can even begin to have clearer ideas in Switzerland and Austria, clearer ideas of where these people went. And there are great connections. As you move through this, there are great connections that are to not be missed. One of them is the fact that a people called the Galatai, who are associated with the Celts, will actually begin to move back towards Phrygia and settle there, just a little bit beyond. And there's no coincidence that the people who Paul later, the Apostle Paul later in the New Testament writes to the Galatians, the connection is very clear. These are people who actually returned back to that area and settled there. And these are not, there's been a lot of debate. Are these Gauls or these French people? Who are they? Well, they're definitely not French, that's for sure. Because they would have been going the other direction. As for the Cimmerians, C-I-M-M, Cimmerians, Diodorus Siculus says that they dwelt beneath the bears. That means they dwelt beneath the areas of Ursa Major and Minor, the bears, Germany, Poland, that whole region through Scandinavia. And we begin to trace these people, and the historians begin to lay what I've called the incredible breadcrumbs. You begin to see there can be no accident. Now, what about these other people? What about these other folks that I seem to have leaped over? Okay, by about 400 BC, there are some tribes that will appear in Europe. Eventually, they will settle. And after the death of Alexander the Great, will penetrate Greece. Even though while Alexander the Great was alive, it is chronicled that he met with these people. We're going to now refer to them as the lost tribes. He met with these people to plead with them to not enter in to the territory so that he could pursue his conquests. And they did for a time, and after his death, they did actually enter into Greece. And by the way, that wouldn't be the first time, because you've got to go back to follow a different tribe and a different wave of people to explain the folks that might have already been in Greece. So it's got a little bit complicated. At some point, you might actually be killing your own relatives. Now, the people who are in what I've called the Medes, in the place we call the Medes. I'm going to read a passage out of the small, hard-to-find book. It's one of those I'm sure not too many people read. It's not favorite reading of the day. I'm almost there. Here we go. Amos, the 7th chapter, and it's not the cookie guy. Amos in chapter 7, if you're reading in chapter 7, it says something like this, beginning at verse 9, the high places of Isaac shall be desolate. It's interesting, the high places of Isaac, but a strange way to mention something. But that's not just the only mention of Isaac. If you comb through this, you'll find there is the reference there. The high places of Isaac shall be desolate, and the sanctuary of Israel shall be laid waste. So there's a distinction being made there. If you take the time to comb through this small book, you will find some other breadcrumbs just like that separate and a distinction, what I'd call a reference to the house of Isaac right here, that begins to make clear the people who will be referred to. Remember I said it's Tiglath-Pileser in 745, his timeline, way back there, that established cities, and one of them was called Sakka, S-A-K-K-A, that's the phonetic sound, which takes you back to the names that some other of these people will be identified with, the house of Isaac, the Sakkai, and the Iskuza, these people who are going to be referenced now, a different group of people. You think if they all stuck together, they'd all be called by one name. But in fact, we have different groups. And these groups, this particular group of the house of Isaac, will begin to move and will bear the name eventually Scythian. Now, if you remember, I talked about Cyrus meeting his death by the hand of Queen Tamiris, the queen of the Massagetae, who actually is the queen of Sak, as in the group, the tribe, the house of Isaac. She was their leader. So it's terrible that such a great leader fell at the hands of a woman. What a pity. But what I want to say to you is that you begin to trace these people, the Scythian people, and you find that there is a great history. And these people become known for their ability to pack up and move rather quickly. They lived in temporary structures like the Sukkuth. So people have said that the name Scythian and Sakkai not only relate to Isaac, but also relate to Sukkuth, to the quick moving of those temporary houses. However you want to put that down, you're going to find that as we trace these people, and I'm almost out of time, so I think I'm not going to give you any more information beyond this, just to say to you that at this point, the people, this different group of people from the land in the mountains of the Medes, will begin to move. These Scythians will appear, and we've got a group of people, as I said, tracing back to, I just referenced the queen, and the difficulty where people fall off the cliff all the time is in making associations with things that seem perfectly reasonable. They're not just random. Where do you think we get the word Saxon from? Saxon, Sac. Now, we have our ideas of spelling, but phonetically, toss that out the window. You realize that there's this incredible ability to trace. And I've told you when we begin to talk about the history of Englaland, and we talk about those invading tribes, the Sacs, the Jutes, these Germanic people, you begin to see that where the flow of the people go begins to be truly scattered. And they went, by the way, another prophet says they went to another land, scattered beyond this land. You begin to trace these people, the tribe of Dan, who we will do, and the most famous person of the tribe of Dan in the Old Testament undoubtedly is Samson from the book of Judges, who historically, many people don't make this connection, but historically, if you read the Greek mythology about Hercules, there is definitely a reason to question that Hercules, the mythological Hercules, and Samson are not put into a framework that actually are the same personages. Why? Because somewhere beyond the gates of Hercules, as they are traveling, and that's what the place is named, is where the tribe of Dan sailed off and into that direction. And there's no, if you read the passage about how Samson stood with these two, between the two pillars, you can trace all of this information to see that at some point, these people are not lost. And in fact, This is the problem when people refer to Jews in the world and when they refer to people who are following God and they can't understand that somewhere in the mess of this woodpile, God says, I got it all under control. I know where these people are. When we talk about Great Britain, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and who was there first, that's its own interesting history to follow through, just as much as if we begin to go back to the tribe of Judah and follow those that went to the place which I'm not going to open that door because you'll say that's too much information. What I want you to know is, as I've laid this down, I know now I have to pick up at some point next week, or you'll just have to be here to find out. But the information is overwhelming. And if you're willing to actually look between the Bible, and I'm using King James, and the Apocrypha, and the Septuagint references, and if you're willing to take some of the auxiliary information, and there's an abundance of it, you begin to see that these people left a trail. And ultimately, God is saying, these people are not lost. Now, when we get to it, which we're so far away from, which is that passage out of Ezekiel 37, where God tells the prophet to take 2 sticks, one for the house of Israel and one for the house of Judah, and put them in one hand, and essentially there's the reunification. This is why I said to you, super important to understand prophetically what must happen. We're not even there. People right now are not even, and people have been studying this subject clearly from about the mid-1800s. This has been a subject of interest, which is many crazy, nutty people have taken off and spun theories about all kinds of things that, it starts off good and then they end up with some like, well, we're the ones. Nobody else is, but we are, And so we have the right to whatever. But if you'll follow the trail, you find some incredible information that leads us back to future, better understanding of future prophecies regarding the end times. Remember, somewhere before I got involved in all of this, we were actually studying the book of Revelation, right? Now, this is a big excursus for a reason, because there's just no way to understand some of the things that are prophetically uttered by the prophet Daniel and Ezekiel. There's no way to understand them without all of this background woven in, that the prophecies that are given to them that are yet to be fulfilled become perfectly clear as to who is doing what. And we may find out that the people that we first pointed the finger at saying worst offenders, they may find out that their roots are not at all who they think they are. That's the greater mystery, by the way. Later religions might hate me, I don't care. Later religions, people who are followers of later religions, I'm talking about after the time of Christ. So you do the math, there's not that many of them. Later religions might find out that they are not the people they think they are, but in fact they may be the people that they are essentially killing. That is kind of staggering right there. So, without any more information, I'm going to leave you with that wonderful hanging tidbit, and that's my message. Now, I just want to say this to you. Maybe sit. I just want to say this to you. If God can know all of this and have control over all of this, even though we don't think so, I'm going to say again what I said last week, then you better make sure, just slip that D word out. You better make sure, darn sure, that you understand God's got the details of your life. It may look completely messed up. It may look like you are lost and glazed over and that God's not even interested in whatever you've been doing, or maybe whatever your thoughts are. But this type of material doesn't make you initially think of what I just said, but in the bigger picture, it should. It says that God cares about the details of your life and mine, and He is the God of details, the importance of the small things as well as the big things. If you're feeling like these people who have been labeled lost, you aren't. God's got your back, and He's in control. And that should be the governing message of each one of these messages. The information is a lot, but the bigger picture is God's in control. Don't forget that. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.